It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Daily Beast World editor Nico Hines joins us from London. How's things been?
Not bad at all. Happy New Year.
Bonne année to you, and bonne année as well to Dave Clark, news editor at the French news agency AFP, who joins us from Brussels. How are things there?
Brussels in January, it's raining.
It's raining.
And it's very cold.
Is it raining in Abidjan, the banks of the Laguna? We can turn to France 24 West Africa correspondent Hanan Ferjani. How are you?
Bonne année to you too. I'm great. How are you?
All right. We are...
It is not raining in Abidjan.
It is. Thanks for rubbing it in. We are awaiting. The Skype gods are not cooperating yet. Catherine Field, Europe correspondent for New Zealand Media and Entertainment. But before Catherine connects, let's just tell you that you can listen on the go to The World This Week on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other fine streaming services. The ball's in the court of an Australian appeals judge, the immigration minister revoking the 34-year-old Serbian Novak Djokovic's visa on public interest grounds this 3 days before the start of the Australian Open. The defending champion still practicing, but the wagons are circling around the seemingly unvaxxed Djoko after apparent, pies on his visa entry form. Nico Hines, his chances don't look great.
Well, possibly not, although the judge that he's speaking to did seem to kind of rally behind him quite comprehensively in the first round of this battle when it went to court. And I think, Djokovic and the judge in the first instance did have quite a good point, which was that the visa has been issued. It wasn't his fault that it was issued. Admittedly, they've now found that not everything he wrote on the form was exactly true, but the basic fundamental point that he hadn't been vaccinated, but he had a positive COVID test a few weeks ago. For whatever reason, Australia bent their rules and said he could come to take part in their showpiece event, and so he did what they told him and he came.
But let's go over that timeline, Nico. It happens before it emerged that he'd been to Spain. He'd been spotted training at the Marbella Tennis Club, and also that he then returned back. He's supposed to sit in place for 2 weeks under those Australian rules.
Yeah, and I think it'd be very difficult to have any actual sympathy for Novak Djokovic, despite what the judge said the first time round, because it seems that he wasn't living by the letter of the law. And I know a lot of us have been frustrated over the last few years, and sometimes we try and stretch what we can get away with. But the idea that the best tennis player in the world thought he could strut around the world and ignore the rules obviously sticks in the craw. And apart from anything else, it was pretty dumb because people notice when he's in town. And he's been caught out because people noticed. In fact, he wasn't exactly under the radar. He did a big interview with L'Equipe while he was in Spain. So he's rather only got himself to blame for getting caught, I think.
Only got himself to blame. There's still one land where Novak Djokovic can do no wrong, and that's his native Serbia. Expatriates from that country down under are as vocal as is the support back home, starting with his own family.
The vaccination, it's not that I'm against vaccination. Of course, I'm not. But I think that also if you are vaccinated, it's not that you are protected from the coronavirus. Lots of people that they have 2 vaccines or 3 vaccines, they get ill. So I don't understand this law that only if you are vaccinated, you can play.
Dave Clark, your reaction?
Well, obviously the Novak Djokovic's own case is getting mixed up with a broader problem we have around the world at the moment. Public opinion about the coronavirus and about the methods of containing it. There's a lot of suspicion of the virus, and a lot of people who simply, in my view, do not understand science or the health statistics, who will grab at the ideas to justify their own instincts. Here in Brussels, we've had quite a lot of street demonstrations against anti-coronavirus measures, and we hear the same things coming up again and again. Oh, the vaccine doesn't save you. You know, you can still catch the virus, and so forth. This proves that it's all ridiculous. It's, you know, disinformation and misinformation and the conspiracy theories have been a problem for a very long time, forever, I suppose, although exacerbated in recent years by social media. But now it's spreading into international affairs. You know, there's Serbia versus Australia. It's spreading into the sporting world and some of the world's most elite tournaments. It's an intriguing sideshow.
Is it a sideshow? Let's turn to Catherine Field. She is plugged in with us now. Catherine, when you hear Novak Djokovic's mother, it's not a sideshow anymore.
No, it's not a sideshow. Good evening, Francois. Sorry I was late. Yeah, this has been a big item in the news around the world, but particularly down under where I come from. And let's be honest here, no one comes out of this at all well. You've got Tennis Australia, who claim that Novak Djokovic is the man that can make their Grand Slam final financially viable. You've got the federal government of Australia, who seems to have fumbled along the way. And then you've got Djokovic, who has, as you know, Nico says, comes across as somewhat arrogant, somewhat dubious. And of course, we then back to this question of personal freedoms or collective good. And generally, now we see this has turned even more to where we're getting into the whole question of money in sport, and even more, we're getting into victimhood. And we're now back to a conversation we didn't think we'd have again, which is the whole notion of, that Serbia being the sort of pariah state, the country where everyone is persecuted all the time. So I think there's a lot of blame to go around, and which we're losing sight of this big picture, which is that Victoria, the state where the Melbourne Open is held, had more than 260 days of lockdowns during the COVID crisis. Their hospital admissions are going up. And we've got a country, Australia, that is struggling to find its way to live with COVID. And just yesterday, the state government of Western Australia announced really stringent vaccine pass rules that are going to come in from the end of January there, that will include, excluding unvaccinated people from bars, hospitals, restaurants, you name it. And the state premier said these are going to be in place for a long time. So down under, this is really a big issue, and it doesn't seem as though it's going to dampen down, certainly in the next few days.
Hanan Farjani, do you have the sense that this week maybe was a bit of a turning point, not so much, quote unquote, against the unvaccinated, but against those who flout the rules?
Well, listen, I definitely think that it is a bit of a surprise to see, such tough decisions taken against someone like Novak Djokovic. And I think that the reaction, the public outcry has definitely inspired that. And is it a show that the tide is turning against the ones that tout the rules? I cannot say personally, but I think that it's important that that it is shown that no one should be above the law, and that even people who are in positions of privilege, whether they're sports people, athletes, can have to abide by those rules. Of course, I heard someone earlier say that the issue with popular opinion when it comes to COVID, and that's international, it actually even is the same issue that we have here in West Africa, is that there's still a lot of misconception. It's still a lot of skepticism that surrounds this disease, this pandemic, and it's the new variant and the vaccine itself, and that also polarizes people around this issue, and it doesn't make for easy decisions to be taken.
What is interesting also to see is that top-flight tennis is a small world, so it's slightly surprising to see Novak Djokovic's partners on the circuit break ranks.
To go out tonight, and I say to you, please.
Stefan Tsitsipas, who is the fourth seed in the Australian Open, which once again opens on Sunday.
No one would have really thought, I can just come to Australia unvaccinated and not having to follow the protocols that they gave me.
Catherine Field, is there a sense that that perhaps Novak Djokovic rubs people the wrong way?
There is that. Yes, he does have this slightly arrogant demeanor. But I think even deeper than that is to remember that people like me, the Australians, we haven't been able to go home for all this time. We were locked out of going back to Australia and New Zealand because of COVID. So to actually see, as Nico was saying, to see Djokovic kind of strolling in and tweeting from the airport as he was about to board the plane and then tweeting a picture when he was on the plane, that really rubs people up the wrong way when families were split up for almost 2 years. I think he will live to regret many things, but most of all, perhaps that tweet that he sent with him at the airport ready to get on the plane.
All right, speaking of people who've made sacrifices and who are a little bit bitter about the way things have unfolded with the high and mighty, turn back the clock, if you will, to the spring of 2020. There's lockdown, weddings postponed, families unable to say farewell to dying loved ones, and a British Prime Minister is asking citizens to each do their bit.
Some people may, of course, be tempted to go out tonight, and I say to you, please don't. I know how difficult this is and how it seems to go against the freedom-loving instincts of the British people.
Of course, fast forward to today, and we know that they were partying. And the stories about parties keep coming out in London. The Prime Minister, stung by the revelation that he attended a Bring Your Own Booze Downing Street garden party, where invites had gone out to 100 staffers. But before the BYOB party, there was April the 16th, and a farewell party was thrown for Johnson's departing director of communications. That happened while the Queen was forced to mourn in solitude the death of her husband of 73 years. Inside of the Conservative Party, the calls are now growing louder.
When I went into that garden just after 6 on the 20th of May, 2020, to thank groups of staff before going back into my office 25 minutes later to continue working, I believed implicitly that this was a work event. But, Mr. Speaker, with hindsight, I should have sent everyone back inside.
Nico Hines, what do you think of work events?
Well, the clip you just played there, what was cut off was Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party's response, which was, so the Prime Minister's telling us he doesn't know when he's at a party. And I think, the idea that he's saying something with an apparently straight face that every single person listening knows is not true is just incredibly damaging. Whatever you think about his policies,
is it damaging, Nico?
Brexit,
is it really damaging? I mean, this, he's always been what they call in where you are a chancer.
Yeah, I think people in Britain have a certain respect for a scallywag, a chancer, someone who's going to not play by the rules, and especially if they're thumbing their nose at kind of the authority figures, or, someone like Robin Hood is a sort of, romantic outlaw and somebody that's cherished by the British public. And Boris Johnson skirted that line, and a lot of people respected the fact that he, didn't stand for, say, Brussels bureaucrats or the establishment rules that said you couldn't do certain things within politics, and people liked his cheeky side. But what they're finding now is that he's laughing at them. And nobody likes to be laughed at in their face. Nobody likes to be lied to in the face. And the latest opinion polls suggest that 8% of people in Britain believe what he's saying about the parties, and only 9% think it's acceptable that they were holding these parties. So he's really got himself on the wrong side of the argument this time.
Dave Clark?
What's been interesting to me in the past few days, obviously, nobody's very surprised about who Boris Johnson is anymore, but it's been interesting later in the week is the kind of direction that the stories are coming from. Now, the initial revelations obviously came from largely from opposition-oriented newspapers. The Daily Mirror took the lead on this, and then the rest of the media followed in quite quickly. The last three revelations of parties, if we count the two parties that became one as everyone got drunker and wandered out in the garden with a suitcase full of wine to trash the kids' swings and so forth. The one on the eve of the Prince Philip's funeral, the communications director who was leaving that night and whose party it was went on to become the deputy editor of the Sun newspaper. And the Sun newspaper obviously knew about all these parties because their deputy editor attended them, and they hadn't been reporting them with the same enthusiasm as some of their colleagues. The last three stories that came out from the Daily Telegraph, which is the newspaper that Boris Johnson himself used to work for, and that he flew back from the COP summit in Glasgow to attend a drinks party with its editors. He's still very much aligned with the Daily Telegraph. I assume that's where he'll go back to when his time in office is eventually over. But so something has changed. Every time a new outrage comes out, it's always tempting to think, "Oh, this is what undermines him." But and up to now, he has always survived everything that's come his way. I think something has changed in the past few days, that the British elite senses that there's blood in the water, and it's time for someone new. Although the mechanism to get rid of him will be quite complex, and I think it probably makes sense for the Tories to keep him in office at least until they get a battering in the May local elections.
The May local elections, of course, it could happen sooner. Let's hear just one of the reactions to the latest revelation, as Dave was saying, from the Daily Telegraph, this coming from inside of Boris Johnson's own cabinet.
This story this morning, like you as well, I was shocked to read it. This is a particularly somber time, of course, for our whole country. The whole nation shared with Her Majesty in her mourning.
Catherine Field, you agree with Dave that it's going to be a few months at least before or if Boris Johnson's forced out?
Well, first off, listening to that clip, Francois, he was shocked that this happened. Reminds us all of that scene in Casablanca, where he's shocked, deeply shocked to have discovered these things were going on. Well, no, he's deeply shocked that they were caught. I think it's going to be very difficult for them to get Boris Johnson out. Clearly, it's in the Labour Party's interest to keep him there. The Labour Party isn't yet strong enough to be able to do that well in the polls at the moment if there were general elections, which are very difficult to bring in the United Kingdom. So it really does suit the Labour Party to have a weak Prime Minister. I think the bigger question, though, around this, Francois, has been that people have seen just how little the democratic safeguards have actually worked in this instance. We were used to the press being, open, vocal, and as Dave pointed out, lots of these newspapers knew what was going on, didn't report it, so that hasn't happened. Boris Johnson and his entire cabinet have ridden roughshod over Parliament really pretty much since he took office. We had the Supreme Court that had to order them to reopen Parliament after he illegally prorogued Parliament so as he could get his Brexit deal through. So I can't see an election soon unless this weekend every Conservative voter or would-be Conservative voter sends an email to their MP or walks into the constituency office this weekend and says, "I've had enough." And I think that's the only way that we're going to see Boris perhaps out on his ear anytime soon, because our only next hope would be for the parliamentary committee to have a look at what the civil servant who is putting out a report about these parties, is going to come up with, because clearly, Boris has batted this away. He's handed it over to the civil servant to come up with a report. And at the end of the day, that civil servant is answerable to the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. So it will be up to Boris Johnson to decide next week whether or not he has to do anything about this.
Do you share, Nico Hines, that sentiment that the checks and balances of Britain's parliamentary democracy have been eroded?
Well, we don't have any checks and balances. That's one of the main problems with our political system. Basically, if you have a majority in the House of Commons, you can do whatever you want. That's always been the case. Way back when the House of Lords perhaps had a bit more influence, but that's such a discredited organisation now that all they can really do is tinker around the edges. So, yeah, I mean, it's not really a question of checks and balances. What ought to be the case and has been the case up until now, and this is where Boris Johnson really has changed British politics, is that there used to be a sense of shame. And so, yes, politicians were still up to no good and were doing things to benefit themselves and were trying to get away with all sorts of scams and schemes. But if they got caught, they would be forced to resign. Newspapers would expect it, other politicians would call for it, and inevitably, if a story hung around for a couple of days, a minister or even a prime minister would tend their own resignation and would step down. And Boris Johnson has come in with this brazen Trump-style attitude that he doesn't care what anybody says and he's willing to just bulldoze his way through. And it's difficult to know whether we'll go back to the old system after him.
All right, and we shall see then if this plays out sooner or later. This was the week where West Africa's patience ran out with the junta in Mali, a summit of regional body ECOWAS, slapping an embargo on coup leaders who reneged on their promise to stage elections next month, instead pushing polls back by another 4 years. For the landlocked nation that's fallen prey to Islamist insurgents, the sanctions are indeed harsh, with travel bans and the blocking of financial transactions. This Friday, Malians answering the call to, quote, defend the homeland by strongman Colonel Assimi Goïta. Big demonstrations taking place in the capital, Bamako, and elsewhere, including the northern city of Timbuktu. There you see, death to France and its allies, reads that one placard in the streets there. Dave Clark, do you feel like there's been a kind of a boomerang effect since the start of the week?
Well, yes, although obviously the demonstrations were called by the junta, so this is a popular uprising, and this is this is manipulating public opinion on your side. It's notable that a lot of these slogans are anti-French, as is traditional, but these are sanctions that were deployed by ECOWAS, and I was surprised at how stringent they were, to be honest. But we can hardly complain that an African regional body is imposing strict sanctions on a coup leader when the criticism often in the past has been the impunity with which enemies of democracy in Africa have been treated by their peers. So they do seem pretty harsh, though, and this will be this will be an economic stranglehold, really, for Mali if they're capable of enforcing them as they stand.
So let's bring in Hanan Farjani. Let's bring in Hanan Farjani on this, because you covered that summit last weekend in Accra, where that West African bloc ECOWAS decided on these sanctions. Why did they come down so hard?
I think that there's many ways of seeing what played out into, West African leaders before this extraordinary summit that took place in Accra. But I think that mostly what lies beneath those decisions, those very tough and unprecedented sanctions, are the idea that, there's an urgency and that there's sort of this democracy state that is in jeopardy in the region, and that they should do everything in their power to prevent a domino effect, that basically letting Assimi Goïta's transitional government sort of backpedal on its initial commitment to hold elections in February 2022 and to propose this chronogram of 5 years was just not acceptable, and that there would be consequences, namely on the stability of the region. That, I think, is the main source of those decisions that have been taken. That, of course, and I want to sort of, sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say, I mean, with due respect to both you and Dave, I mean, West Africa has seen plenty of coups in the past, the most recent example being in September in neighboring Guinea. In this particular case, though, they really seem fed up with Assimi Goïta.
That's true, and that might have been the simple fact that there has been so many back and forths. They sent, emissaries, namely Goodluck Jonathan, to Mali just a few days prior to that summit, trying to basically, find reason and come up with some sort of negotiation plan, some sort of agreement with ECOWAS, which they didn't find. And I think at some point it was just, okay, that's enough. We just have to have a strong stance, and that will probably show Assimi Goïta that we're not playing. And I think there was definitely a lot of ego involved in those decisions. But just going back to the previous point that you made, when it comes to this rising anti-West sentiment that's growing in the region, in particular in Sahelian region such as Mali and Niger, because of the insecurity that is thriving in those places, I think that the fact that we've seen, of course, the EU sort of supporting ECOWAS in that way, and also talking about also sanctioning Mali and giving their own set of sanctions is probably not the best thing for ECOWAS itself, because it might just give more weight to that whole theory that everything is happening because the West is deciding, and that they're the ones deciding everything behind closed doors, and basically ECOWAS leaders are not sovereign in their decisions. I think that's probably the way that that's probably what is helping the junta sort of kind of implement that idea that it's not really an African problem, it's not really an ECOWAS problem, but really it has become bigger. It is about the international community.
Yeah, and in particular France, which is the former colonial power, France, which, coincidence of the calendar, holds the rotating presidency of the European Union. EU foreign ministers meeting in Brest in the west of France the last 2 days, following the lead of the French who, let's just remind you, have 4,800 troops that have been that are still deployed there. The French who intervened to stop a jihadist insurgency back in 2013.
Nous sommes et nous voulons rester au Mali, mais pas à n'importe quel prix. Et nous sommes au Mali pour combattre le terrorisme et pas pour autre chose. Donc nous continuons à suivre la situation de très près et nous allons réunir, après la rencontre des ministres des Affaires étrangères du G5 Sahel que va initier le haut représentant, nous allons réunir la coalition internationale pour le Sahel, pour faire le point de la situation après les décisions prises par la CEDEAO à la suite de la volonté de la junte de ne pas mener la transition dans les délais qu'elle avait initialement prévus.
We'll stay in Mali, but not at any price. Catherine Field, listening to what Hanan just said, is that just going to reinforce this feeling that, it's France pulling the strings?
The junta is in a really difficult position at the moment. It's being squeezed. It's being squeezed by ECOWAS on the financial side with the sanctions, and it's also being squeezed, as you say, by France, that is not prepared to stay in Mali at any price. And we've seen, of course, this week there were pictures which came into the public domain here in France of what purport to show mercenaries from the Wagner group operating in southwest Mali. Now, that's also going to put pressure on the junta in Bamako, because they don't want it known that these mercenaries are operating there. Certainly, Russia doesn't want it known that they're operating there. And also, France doesn't really at the moment want it known that it is there, because if it does turn out that these mercenaries are there, that they are operating, then France will pull out. It will pull its forces into Burkina or into Niger. And when they do that, we will see a repeat of what we saw in Timbuktu, which is the French handing over the base to local forces and pulling out of the country. And in that case, it will be France pulling out and saying to the junta, okay, that's it, we're out, we're leaving you now in the hands of the jihadists and the Wagner mercenaries. And then the junta is going to really be in a much more difficult position than it is today.
Nico Hines, the big surprise, there are still denials, by the way, by the regime, even though we have that evidence, more evidence of the Russian mercenaries of Wagner in Mali. The images we just showed were posted to France 24 this week. They come from a French source from the south-central city of Ségou. They were taken at the end of last month. Those Russian mercenaries, what surprises people is usually in Africa, the mercenaries come in usually to protect the presidential palace or something. Here, it's, it's a bit of there's a bit of confusion as to why they're there, but certainly there is this feeling that the junta wants to thumb its nose at Paris.
Yeah, and I think, this goes all the way back. If you look at the junta itself, several of the people that were involved in the initial coup had come straight from training in Russia prior to carrying out the coup and installing the new regime. And there was a kind of hilarious pro-Russia protest in Bamako last year. You may remember, I think it was around April, and our brilliant correspondent in Africa, Philip Obaji, managed to figure out that this was entirely staged by family members of senior figures within the junta. So they were pretending to hold a kind of popular uprising in favor of Moscow in Bamako. And there's no doubt that Russia is entwined with this entire regime. And so it's not just that they've hired some big soldiers to kind of scare away anyone who might pose a risk to them personally. There's a real danger here that Russia becomes embedded within the state, and I'm sure there'll be big concessions and mining and the kinds of things that the Wagner Group and its associated organisations have won in other African countries. And so I think we have to be a bit careful as well when we talk about anti-colonial feeling and what Bamako is trying to do to rise up against France. And you have to remember that, yes, that's true. And of course, there's good reasons for some of that anti-colonial feeling. But it's also a deliberate provocation being stirred up in Moscow, and deliberately they're trying to create this anti-Western feeling and to convince us that there's a genuine anti-Western uprising in these countries as well.
Dave Clark, a bit of what they called during the Cold War making mischief?
Yes, and it might well pay off for them. People here in Brussels and NATO and so forth often say, Russia's overextending itself, it's getting involved in conflicts it can never win. But when they invested in Syria, they saved Assad's regime with the help of the Iranians. They took Crimea, they took South Ossetia. When they've committed themselves militarily, they have made tactical gains. What the long-term strategy is, I don't know, but if Wagner thinks there's work that it could do helpfully in Mali, there's also a kind of domino effect. The French are not only operating there as the former colonial power, they've been trying to build a European identity surrounding their interventions in West Africa, get away from the old France-Afrique vision of their kind of sole right to intervene in these West African countries in particular. And but there are now reports tonight that the Swedes are thinking of pulling out of the French-led force precisely because of the Wagner deployment. Obviously, Sweden now has problems in its own backyard. It's reinforcing troops on Gotland and the Baltic Sea. Russia is flexing its muscles in Eastern and Central Europe. So it's going to be tricky for France to maintain a European coalition if there's no end in sight to this conflict in Mali. And if anything, in the counterinsurgencies of the past few decades have shown us is that if you don't have a reliable local partner, then there's very little you can do.
Yeah, and just one more point, which was mentioned at the outset of this segment, which is what right now this embargo means for ordinary citizens. No way to wire money. We're talking Mali's one of the poorest nations on earth. No way to do business for Malians in the sub-region, like, for instance, in neighboring Ivory Coast.
We were told that first necessity goods would not be affected. I loaded rice, but they always stop me with my rice, and I still don't know what's wrong.
The majority of wholesalers are in Mali. They come here to load their trucks, but now everything is halted. We have some orders here in Mali that have already been blocked, and we can't get them back on track. We are forced to sell to customers from the country 1 or 2 pieces, while normally we don't sell our products by the piece.
Hanan Farjani, what else did those Malians in Ivory Coast tell you?
Well, first, let me start by saying that I don't know if everyone is aware of that, but Ivory Coast is pretty much the first nation host for Malians across the world. There's 3 million, if not more, Malians in Ivory Coast. So that's a very big community of this Malian diaspora in this neighboring country of Ivory Coast. And numerous people that we talked to, most of them were traders of sorts, were working either in textiles or selling manufactured goods or food products. They're all very worried and they're all very angry, to be quite honest, with ECOWAS, because in their view, this is not Assimi Goïta and his transitional government that you're punishing. It's the average Malian. It's us who are not going to be able to send money to our families back home. We're not going to be able to produce that wealth that we usually produce that creates sort of this, a parallel economy that's very good for Mali. And also it's not going to be very good for commercial relations between the 2 countries, which are interconnected and kind of depend on each other. And we also spoke to who would be considered the spokesperson for the Malian community here, that is the head of the Malian Council in Abidjan, who told us the exact same thing and who went as far as saying that they would release a statement in the next few days condemning ECOWAS's sanctions and basically showing support to the junta. Now, of course, this might just be a play on just putting pressure on ECOWAS to back off and kind of lift those sanctions, even though ECOWAS has been very clear that it would not give in, that really the ball is in the junta's court. So this is how people are feeling here.
All right, so a lot of tension when it comes to what's going on politically in Mali. There's the Malians are happy with their start on the sporting scene at the Africa Cup of Nations. Of course, there was some controversy. Fans of the beautiful game know well that sometimes the ref can get absorbed in the game and forget to blow time. The Italy-Argentina semifinal, the 1990 World Cup, springs to my mind because, well, the man in black was French. But to end the game early, twice, meet Zambia's Gianni Zikakzwe at the Africa Nations Cup in Cameroon. He ended Tunisia-Mali in the 85th and then in the 89th minute. Dave Clark, what do you make of that?
Well, as a fellow fan of the beautiful game, first of all, one of the things I enjoy the best is the talking points afterwards. And that's a particularly unusual one. But arguing about the referee's decisions is all part of football. If in this case, it seems very obvious that he made a mistake. People are saying that maybe he had sunstroke. He'd suffered in 35-degree heat, very humid weather there. Although he's from Zambia, he must be used to a certain amount of heat. But then, why didn't the 4th official nudge him and say, "Look, we've got to play on a few more minutes"? I don't think it calls into question the tournament. I don't think it's a shame for African football or for Cameroon or I think this referee will probably be suspended.
Nico Hines.
Most of all, the fans will have something to talk about afterwards.
Right. Nico Hines, he apparently that's the official reason given, that he was suffering from sunstroke, and that's why he got a little confused. He's normally a good ref.
Well, he is supposed to be one of Africa's best referees. He was representing the continent at the World Cup in 2018 in Russia, and he got a couple of games there. I mean, it should be noted that he was actually suspended later in the year on allegations of corruption. So maybe there are some question marks. I don't know how many times a referee can be suspended for corruption and still allowed to carry on. But I have to say, having watched I didn't watch the whole game, but having watched the highlights, the kind of erratic decisions and the blowing up early twice, it does look rather more like he was having a funny 5 minutes, and maybe he was suffering from heat stroke or something, rather than anything more nefarious.
Hanan Farjani, we're out of time, but let me just ask you, because you're in Abidjan right now, and you know, we have, every time there's an African Nations Cup, it takes place in winter, in the middle of the European season. European clubs complain. What do you say to that?
Right. You know, I just really do not understand the debate, if I'm quite honest with you. I think that it's okay for the Africa Cup of Nations to have its own calendar, to just go about its, local, very contextualized priorities, which have to do with, the weather conditions around that time. It is, the African Federation of Football has found it that it's better to hold this Africa Cup of Nations around January and February. It's part of the tradition as well. It's been happening like this for years. For decades. Just what was going to happen last year, if we had gone with the way that it was supposed to be held in Egypt, it would have changed to a summer competition, but that did not happen, and we revert back to the initial programming, and I think that's perfectly okay. I think that Europeans have to just agree and accept that it's a different calendar, it's different priorities, and if athletes who play in European clubs need to be there and represent the national flags in Africa, they just have to do what is right so that it can be there, and just adapt to whatever schedule we have planned. That's at least my opinion.
All right. Well, Africa certainly has our attention throughout this tournament and more. Hanan Farjani, many thanks in Abidjan. I want to thank as well Nico Hines in London, Dave Clark in Brussels, Catherine Field here in Paris. Thank you for being with us here in The World This Week.